developing these scaffold branches. Thanks, Emily. Uh, and even at this time, there's a lot of flowers. The mango trees that is constantly flowering, and so removing flower tassels was important, and just generally establishing the height of the trunk and the first parts of the scaffold branches. And so let's see, right? So and then this is the second year on let's see on year two. So and then year two comes along. Now the trees are about 4 to 6 feet tall. The canopy is just starting to look good on the trees. Now it takes me from like 2 to 4 minutes per tree to prune. So still pretty quick getting through the orchard. Each tree, even though is still pretty young and 2 years in the ground, each tree can hold maybe 1 to 10 mangoes per tree, right? But there's a consequence of letting the trees hold fruit at this time. And for me, that was the fact that I have feral pigs in my area, and this low hanging fruit is just irresistible to pigs. And I had let the trees hold some fruit. So there was a lot of trees with fruits on them. And as a result, the pigs just came through and just wrecked all the trees. They broke low branches. They ate all the mangoes. They would climb some of the trees. They just broke the whole tree in half. And by the end of that second year, I probably had about 100 trees out of the 310 that were just completely damaged and needed to be restructured. Some of them I had to reestablish scaffold branches. Some of them lost all its low branches, so it was automatically higher canopy. The canopy was automatically higher because of that. And but not only that, but if the pigs hadn't eaten the fruit, some of the trees had too much fruit on them, and that would bend down the branches. And at the end of the season, I would have to go back and reestablish the scaffold branches, right? So it was important to not to let the trees hold too much fruit at the second year because it just sets you back in the long run. And for me, it was a big setback because of the pigs. Um, and then also at the second year, because I had used black weed mat, right, on all the trees. And you can see from here that at this point, the grass is just completely covered over the weed mat. And so I find that the weed mat was really, really beneficial over the first couple of years, and especially for me because I didn't have a tractor. All I had was a lawnmower, and I didn't have a way to move mulch. So getting mulch to being able to put wood chips or mulch around the trees was just hard for me because I didn't have the tractor. So I went with the black mat, and it was really good for the first 2 years. But after the second year, I started running it over with the lawnmower, and it starts snagging on different things, and then it just gets in the way. And so that black mat really is a temporary use in the field. And after the second year, I would suggest starting to remove that black mat before it just becomes too much of a pain. And so, by the end of the second year, canopies were nice and formed. The trees were about 4 to 6 feet tall. There was still more canopy to be developed going into the third year, but it was just seeing a lot of flowering, right? And so the third year, we end up with by the end of the third year, except for the trees that were damaged or needed to be replaced, most of the trees were already at their height that I would want them, which was about 6 to 8 feet, and the canopy was about 6 feet diameter, and the trees were ready to hold fruit. And so this third year, we had a lot of fruit on the trees. And what happened was the pigs ate 80% of the fruit, and the birds ate 20% of the fruit, which left me with 0% of the fruit. And that was the first time that they'd eaten more fruits than it would have cost me to put in a fence, right? And so that was the incentive to get a fence in after the third year, and they had eaten all the mangoes. So as far as this high density orchard goes, and the low hanging fruit is, it goes both ways. It's easier to harvest this low hanging fruit, but it's also easier for animals and people to come in and harvest the fruits themselves. So if you in an area that has wild pigs and you cannot fence in your field, then you're not going to be able to adopt to this system, because the low hanging fruit is just too easy for the pigs to come in and get. And really, any of the, and we have Pharaoh chickens, and we have also Franklins that really love to eat mangoes. So any fruit that is really hanging at eye level for the chickens, which would be kind of like this fruit right here, they're gonna get pecked on by the birds, and so you're not going to be able to harvest those either. So managing the birds, managing the animals, fencing, putting in perimeter fencing, uh, is key to the success with this orchard style. And so looking back at at at, at the system that I was looking at in 2016 with the trees, like I said, instead of planting at a 2 by 3 meter spacing, I had widened it out to that by 8 by 10 foot spacing, which was about 450 trees per acre. And at this point, so this picture wasn't taken very long ago, but at this point, the dilemma I have with this field is, what do I do with the high density nature of it? Because you can see, you cannot see throughout the whole row anymore. So some of these trees have grown into the next row over. So I think it's a little bit too dense, or I let the trees get too big and now they need to be brought down. So I'm faced with how to manage this field going forward. I can either remove half the field and then just completely cut down the trees, 5 rows of the trees, and then that would give me a lot of space to operate in, a lot of room for the tractor, and a lot of room, a lot more air flow and sunlight by doing this, right? And because I've started to notice that it does restrict a little bit of sunlight at this point. There's shading out, and I think and because it's so dense that the pests have just increased, like the scale and mealybugs and aphids. I'm starting to see a little bit more of that. So I'm thinking, how am I going to increase the airflow? How am I going to increase the sunlight and make more room for me to get in there? Because I can get in with my zero turn track lawnmower, but if there's any fruits on the trees, then I probably can't get in very much. So this year, instead of so this year was that crux where I had to make a decision on what to do, but instead of removing 5 of the rows completely, I decided that I was going to prune heavy 5 of the rows. And so I took them down. A lot of the trees were at about 10 feet, um, between 8 to 10 feet. So I took the canopy down on half of the rows down to 4 feet or 4 to 5 feet, pretty much took off the whole canopy and went down to the scaffold branches. And then I expect that it's going to skip at least 1 year of production. But in the meantime, the other trees will be happier. Perhaps the fruit quality will be better because of the added sunlight and airflow in the field, right? And so now I'm going to do that. And I think I'm going to wait 2 years to that, to the heavily pruned trees come back into production. And then I'm going to take their other 5 rows down and do a 2 year canopy replacement kind of cycle, and see how that works. And this technique will keep everything still done by hand, right? Because you still won't be able to get a tractor through. So all management, pruning, pesticide applications, fertilizer applications still got to be done by hand, and because of the density of the trees. And we'll see. If it doesn't work in a couple of years, I'll probably go back and remove half the trees so that I have all the space that I need to operate comfortably. Because that's what it's about, being comfortable in your orchard. So here's a little bit better picture. Yeah, so most of the trees, they're not touching at this point, even in the orchard. They're still freestanding. They're not hedged at all. Every year when I prune it, I can prune it back to where they none of the branches are touching each other, and you can still see for the most part straight through the orchard. Trees are bigger than others. Here you can see how some of the keat mangoes had because even though they get tall, they're still pretty lanky, and when you get that big fruits on them, like I don't know if you grow keat mangoes, but they'll be 1.25 pound all the way to 2.5 pounds, 3 pounds, so they get pretty big and heavy, and then once they hold their fruit, some of my trees that were like 12 feet tall and fruited on the top, the whole branch bent down to the ground and pretty much to the other row, 10 feet away. And so keeping your trees from getting that lankiness is really important on managing the orchard, and then you can avoid things like this happening. And then let's see, we talked about higher quality fruit, easier canopy management, which is absolutely true as far as being able to observe your canopy, applications, because you need to treat for powdery mildew, and you're going to need to treat for anthracnose if you're in a hot, humid, wet area. And so the canopy management is definitely improved versus the big tall trees. 3 years to orchard maturity, I can say that the trees were ready at 3 years, but it takes more than just the trees being ready in order to get a good production, right? You gotta have the weather cooperating, as well as you have your orchard protected from outside pests. And then yields 8 to 12 tons. So yield is tricky. Yield has with the variety that you planted. Now, because the orchard that I planted was all mixed varieties, I couldn't get a very good uh, understanding of the per acre production, right? But what I could see is that the consistency of how much mangoes each tree was presenting was each tree was producing. And from what I see from the keat mangoes, that they were consistently producing about 50 to 75 mangoes per tree. And we have had as much as 150 mangoes on one of these trees. And as little as 2 mangoes, right? And so there's a big variation, but for the most part, all of the trees were producing between 50 and 75 mangoes. And with that kind of production in a 1 acre field with 450 trees, we're talking about 14 to 21 tons per acre. Now, like I said, the global average is about 3.5 tons. And your goal as a farmer is usually around 5 tons per acre. So the idea of being able to produce 15 or 14 to 21 tons per acre is just out of country. That is just hard to imagine. But I've been seeing it in the orchard. The thing is, you cannot do that with every mango. There's only a small handful of mangoes that is that productive that could produce that kind of numbers. And I think the keat mango, which is one of the best commercial varieties in the world, is one of the most productive varieties, has the potential to do 14 to 21 tons per acre. But I don't think any of these other varieties have that same potential just because of the variety, right? And so each place in the world has their own varieties. Was there a question?
Yes, Umi, this is Peter. I had a question. How did you decide on the varieties for this test?
Well,
Were they just the ones that you commonly would grow here anyway, or were you going for high production variety?
I was absolutely going for high production varieties, and these are varieties that were identified as being, commercial producing varieties, except for the white berry. The white berry was the one outlier out of these varieties. The white berry is one of the most favorite mangoes in Hawaii. All of the old timers know the white berry, and if any of you have had white berry, it has a really strong fragrance. If you have a box of white berries, You'll be able to smell it in the room off of the skin and the sap. And not all mangoes have a smell like that, and it's really distinctive. So white berry has always been one of Hawaii's favorite mangoes. That was why I chose that one. But the rest of these varieties are well known, or the Keat and the Namdagmai are well known internationally, and the Raposa is is a Hawaiian mango that was developed in Hawaii that is really high quality and has commercial potential. And Manzanillo as well. It's not really planted a lot in commercial settings, but it's a really nice, productive, good mango. So I did choose mangoes for their commercial production, right? So so back to that, like there's only a handful of mangoes that can produce like these outrageous tons of production, right? And maybe and not all of the mangoes are very good. In my opinion, the Keat mango is one of the best mangoes there is as far as production and taste, and just the overall quality of the mango. Whereas you have like the Tommy Atkins mango, and Tommy Atkins is probably the most productive mango there is. It's so resistant to anthracnose. It's so beautiful, but the flavor isn't there. The shelf life is not always there, and the experience, the eating experience of the Tommy Atkins mango is not always there. But it is one of those mangoes that could possibly produce at that kind of rate just because of how productive it is, right? And so again, in my field, the Namdak Mai, again, very productive, 50 to 75 mangoes per tree, but it's a smaller mango, but it's really productive. So I've had Namdak Mais with like maybe 150 mangoes on them, even 200 mangoes on these small little trees. But anytime you have that much mangoes, then you're gonna deal with then you're probably better off culling the mangoes down. If you have 150 mangoes on a namdakmai, you'd be better off culling it down to 75 mangoes, and that'll produce a nicer mango. It won't be rubbing up in each other, and it'll get bigger. If you do 150 mangoes on a small tree, they'll all be like half pound to 3/4 pound mangoes, right? They'll be smaller. So culling the mangoes down to 50 to 75 for the Namdagmai will do better. And I think you could do 8 to 10 tons on an acre with that. Again, like really high numbers. The same with Raposa and Manzanillo. I kind of group those two together because they have the same season. They come into ripe at the same time. And, they'll produce
Umi,
25. Yes.
this is Nat. Good to
Hi,
see you
Nat.
again. Long time. um, are you gonna get into like dollars per tree for the varieties as well as tonnage? Because like,
I
couldn't
was
some like white Puri get fetch a higher price per pound than a Keat?
I wasn't gonna get into pounds or prices as much, but I can talk a little bit about it. I mean,
Yeah, I'd be
the thing
interested
about
if
the white berry, other than the recognition as being one of Hawaii's favorite mangoes, it just it just doesn't attract people that don't know about this mango nearly as much. So if I have a table with all of these varieties laid out, the first ones that'll go is the Raposa and the Manzanillos because they're big and they're red and they're beautiful. And it's
got it.
never hard to sell those. And those just like fly off the shelves. And then the Keats go because the Keats, even though these pictures show pretty attractive mangoes, a lot of time the Keats are just green. They don't really ripen with a lot of color, and 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 they're so big. I think it throws off people that they're just so big sometimes that they sell a little bit slower. But the last ones to always sell is the white piri. I think because yellow mangoes don't sell nearly as good, and because they're smaller mangoes. These are like they're usually about 1 pound or maybe 3/4 of a pound each, and so I always have the hardest time selling the white peas, and so
I'll buy
it's
them.
still appearance. Yeah. Well, once we do tastings, then it's not hard at all to get people to choose the white berry. But without any kind of tasting, they automatically choosing the Raposas and the Manzaninos over everything.
So people
And
just
then
don't use their nose when they're buying as much as they should.
yeah, right. And so that has been interesting. And also the processors don't like the smaller mangoes either, right? The processors, they want the keep because they get the most for their money. You get all of that mango with the very little seed. And when you compare like the seed and skin ratio to flesh ratio, what you find is that the keep is probably somewhere like 15% skin and seed to flesh ratio, whereas the white period is closer to 30% skin and seed to flesh ratio, and so that makes a big difference for people that are using, that are processing mangoes as well. And then so for the white berry, this, like I said, this is the outlier of these five varieties. The white berry is not a commercial variety because it's just not very productive as well. It's very susceptible to powdery mildew, very susceptible to anthracnose. This tree is always the first one to get micronutrient deficient, and and so overall we get about 25 to 40 mangoes per tree. I think you can do maybe 4 tons at the high end, 6 tons per acre, but uh I really think white pea is not a profitable mango. You couldn't profit from it, even though it's excellent eating mango and a lot of people's favorites. It just doesn't translate in sales, right? So when we're talking about yields, the variety, in my opinion, the variety is the number one most important aspect of whether or not the mango will be going to produce acceptable yields, and um, and so that has to be a big consideration on whether there's going to be profitability in growing a certain type of mango. Uh, and there's just so much other things that go into yields, right? So much other factors. So here's some examples of a keep mango that easily has 100 mangoes on it, and it's not very big. It's not a very big tree, right? It still uh, fits into that orchard. Here's another one. Uh, right, and so then this is what I have here. This is my newest orchard. This was planted in 2022, and for my newest planting this is 10 feet by 20 feet because ultimately I needed more space. My goal is to not have to manage everything by hand. My goal is to have as much tractor mechanical production as possible because I don't have the labor. Um, the labor force is just not here in Hawaii, right? And so, but I want to grow this orchard to say 25 acres. I'm not going to be able to do it by hand. I'm not going to necessarily be able to hire enough people to manage that orchard, and mechanical production is just definitely got to be in the plan. So I opened up the spacing to 20 feet. Now I can get any tractor in here easily enough. Lots of comfort when we're picking, when we're harvesting. We don't have to be squeezed in with each other. And this is about 250 trees per acre. So I don't expect the same type of production, but with the wider spacing, I can let the trees get a little bit bigger. So instead of holding 50 to 75 trees per acre, I can probably allow these trees to get big enough to hold 100 or 150 trees, 150 fruit per tree. And so less trees, maybe less production, but more mangoes per tree, and that might balance things out a little bit. But it's all a trial, right? This is all still learning for me. But this is my current spacing, 10 by 20 feet, and I'm gonna stick with this from this point on.
So Umi, this is Peter again.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting what your different planting spacings, because it might boil down as you come up with a conclusion later on down the road. It might come down to, well, how big is the piece of land that you have to work with? So for example, if you only have 1 acre, then maybe you say, oh, maybe the best way, the most productive is for me to do the close proximity spacing. But if I have 10 acres or like your case, 20 or whatever, oh, now I have too much space to do it by hand, so I need to space it out so I can automate my management. Does that sound right? I mean, if you have a small
Yeah,
space, would
absolutely.
it be?
Yeah, and really, like when I approached this from the beginning, it was that this was going to be an orchard that was managed by hand by one person. So in that aspect, it kind of played out how it was supposed to play out. That it was always supposed to be managed by hand, and in that case, the high density doesn't really need to be changed. But as I but my operations or like I realized that I'm not gonna be able to do all of this by hand, and I'm gonna have to mechanize a lot of it, and so that's why I'm opening it up. But if you had a quarter acre that you was gonna do with this high density, then yeah, 8 to 10 feet works perfectly. If you had or a half acre or even maybe just two rows of freestanding trees, right, and not even an orchard setting, but just freestanding trees planted in a high density orchard, you know, then the 8 feet by 10 feet works perfectly, right? So that's definitely true in that uh, the density still works. It's just that I would prefer to have more comfort, more space to work in. Yeah. So that has pretty much been my ultra high density field and planting, and it worked. It worked good, but in the end, I opened it up to 10 feet by 20 feet, and I'm hoping that additional space and additional sunlight, additional airflow, and ability to get the tractor in will allow me to continue to grow the orchard.
Umi, there was a question in the chat from Noi. How do you keep the trees from getting lanky? Prune more often. Some varieties seem like they always grow lanky.
Right, absolutely. So like the keat variety, man, that tree just wants to grow straight up, and it doesn't really branch off nearly as much uh as some of the other with the whirl of shoots, right? And so it'll just flush off of the terminal end. Sometimes it'll flush 3 4 times off of the terminal bud with no side shoots, and it'll just want to go straight up and get lanky. And so what I find is that once you establish the scaffold branches, right, so setting the main trunk at the height you want it to be, for me 3 feet, and then the scaffold branches are 4 scaffold branches, say another 2 feet. So now that the tree is 5 feet at the height with the scaffold. So now from that point on, I don't let any of the shoots go beyond one flush. Like for example, I don't really have. So you see like how this has this whole area just with no branches, right? So I wouldn't let this happen here anymore, because what happens is they get lanky and then they get fruit and they bend down to the ground. So instead of letting it go here, where it probably went here a flush to here and then a flush to here and then a flush to here before it started branching off, I would take it back down to this first one, this first flush, and let the shoots come from here, and that would eliminate some of the lankiness, and
That
that's
doesn't
where the
affect the
trickiness
flowering.
comes in. It hasn't so far.
Like, how do you know
And
you're
it
not cutting off the flowers? You know?
you cut off a lot of flowers when you pruning. That's what it happens. So I haven't skipped any of the flowering yet. I've always wondered if I taken off too much, or and then it ends up skipping flowering or not. But then it usually doesn't do that. But really, the key is to be on top of it before you have to make drastic changes, right? And for me, when I had a lot of the tall trees, I took off 1/3 at a time, or I took off the two most vigorous branches and brought those back down, and then that kind of created a little cycle where that particular cut wouldn't flower that year, but the next year it was ready to flower, and the rest of the branches, so half of the tree flowered, right? So
Mhm.
So it ended up working out, but that is a key, is to not let it flush. Once you get the scaffold branches established, to not let it flush more than one node before pruning it, unless there's the whirl of shoots, and then or eliminating the terminal bud as soon as it flushes. That is what I tend to do, and being on top of that really makes a big difference from keeping the fruit off the ground, because they get lanky.
So how often do you find you have to prune if you are on top of it to not let it get?
I just, a lot of the times, the way it's been working for me is right after harvest, I come in and I prune, and then it just goes right into flowering a lot of the time. It doesn't even flush leaves. It just flushes leaves and flowers at the same time. And so in that case, that's it with the pruning. That's it for the pruning for the year for the most part. And but sometimes what happens is it doesn't flower, right? And then it just flushes leaves, and then you're waiting for it to flower. So then it flushes again, but no flowers, just leaves, and then you're waiting for it to flower.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, it's just getting more and more lanky, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, I keep my eyes open, and I'll go in and I'll prune the trees that didn't flower, and
Okay.
and to keep them down, because like when you start skipping that flushes, or when you're not getting that flowering in the flushes, man, the trees get big really quick. Managing vigor in these fields is really hard,
Yeah.
because these trees are vigorous. Even the slowest growing ones eventually become pretty vigorous, right? And unless we can come in with like unless we can find a dwarfing rootstock that can reduce the vigor in the trees, that is always going to be one of the number one challenge with these high density, especially for mango fields, is the vigor is really hard to manage.
Hey, Umi, are you, in terms of
Yeah.
vigor, so we're working on dwarfing rootstocks for most of the Australian varieties at the moment. Are you guys using paclobutrazol or uniconazole at all for vigor control?
No, no one in Hawaii uses PBC, as far as I
Yeah,
know.
okay.
So yeah, and that's mainly because we don't have very many commercial orchards. The 99% of our mangoes are just backyard or standalone trees. But yeah,
Yeah, okay.
the
Because
paclobutrazol has been
that's pretty much
effective.
standard practice in Australian orchards now, is paclobutrazol to control vigor and help with partitioning of resources towards flowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely standard in South America and Mexico as well.
Yeah.
I think I think all, for the most part, all commercial orchards is pretty standard practice, and I've seen the effects of it, and it's pretty outstanding. I mean, I visited orchard in Puerto Rico that it was mostly keep mangoes, and they, with the use of paclobutrazol, it was able to induce flowering every month of the year, and so they were harvesting huge fields every single month of the year, right? Using that, so
Wow.
it's definitely effective, and I've seen the effects of it. It's great. It's pretty great. I hear that Europe is considering banning paclobutrazol, and so there's a lot of people trying to find alternatives to that at the moment.
You mean, is that
Yeah.
But
a
yeah,
type of
Hawaii is pretty.
fertilizer? Is
What was that again?
is this a type of fertilizer that allows the plant to have flowers every month?
It it's a growth retardant, and I'm not really too familiar with it. If anybody would like to speak more on the use of that, but it reduces the vigor in the trees, and it kind of synchronizes flowering. Well,
I can talk about it a bit because we work with it a bit here in terms of our research. It's a gibberellin inhibitor, gibberellin being one of the primary growth hormones in plants. So basically you apply it primarily either as a foliar spray or as a soil drench, and then it's taken up into the plant and interrupts growth processes. So it reduces vigorous cell growth and basically stops the plant from using those resources in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Now, do you have to follow up like potassium nitrate induce the flowering, or does it do it itself with just a Paclo?
We use Paclo primarily for vigor control rather than flower induction. Just basically after we prune, we put Paclo on just so that you don't quite get that same level of lankiness. But I know in some regions of the world, they also use potassium nitrate and things like that for flower induction. There is some research going on that we're a part of at the moment where they're testing different flower inducing agents.
Yeah, and so that was kind of the impression that I got with using paclobutrazol, was that it would inhibit growth, and then and kind of like, and then if you hit it with potassium nitrate, you could get it to flower when you wanted it to flower. And then I think that's how they were doing it in Puerto Rico, in getting it to flower every year, every month. But yeah, in the orchard. So, all right. So that was my ultra high density. And then when I first started with the ultra high density, there was no information on the open Tatura trellis system in Hawaii. But at the same time, stuff started coming out, and we had an Australian farmer, Peter Solaris, who came over to Hawaii and did a couple of demonstrations on the trellises, and that's where I first learned about it. And so I thought that would be a perfect fit into my project. And for the second half, I did 5 trellises of open Tatura trellis, the open Tatura trellis system. So my 5 trellises were 240 feet long on 0.4 acre. Again, the goal was to have it on a half acre, but the trellises were a little bit more compact, a little bit more streamlined than the freestanding trees. So I got 5 trellises on 0.4 acres. And the trees were spaced 8 feet apart on the trellis. The trellises were 15 feet apart on center. I planted 30 trees on each side. So for 60 trees per trellis, a total of 300 trees. Each trellis had 5 wires. The bottom wire started at 24 inches, and then each additional wire was 18 inches apart, with the top wire being at 8 feet height. And again, I used a black weed mat and drip irrigation, and it was planted from north to south in the field. And so with the more compact nature of it, this would probably be closer to 660 trees per acre. I could probably get 6 more trellises at this spacing on 1 acre. And so that was pretty dense. 60 trees. And the goal in establishing on the trellis was to create a 2-dimensional flat canopy. And in order to do that, and for the training, we used the 3-to-1 rule, which came from the creators of the Tatura trellis. And that basically says that when you're establishing lateral growth, or when you're establishing the center leader, that you're going to choose the branch that is 1/3 the size of the main branch, right? So if this main stalk here was 3 inches, then I would choose laterals that were 1 inch thick. Or if this main stalk central leader was 1 inch, then I would choose lateral branches that was 1/3 of an inch. And I did this little sketch because you can't really see the training of the branches with all the leaves on them. So I had a hard time getting pictures where you could really see how it was being trained on the tree. So I drew this little sketch out, and really to see the different things that you would come across when you was training the branches onto the wires, right? And so for my bottom wire, anything, and really the bottom 2 wires, anything that was growing down should be removed, especially from the bottom wire, because you can see here how it grows one flower and all the fruit is on the ground, right? And so that's no good for you. And you find yourself having to go and wind the fruit around the wire in order to get them off the ground, and it's just added labor. In the end, you just remove anything facing down, even on the second one, because the second one will do the same thing. It'll just flush, and then everything will be right back on the ground. Sometimes you have to move the branch down to the wire, which for mangoes worked pretty good. Mango and their lateral growth was not really interrupted by the trellis. Some trees, as soon as you try to bend the branches laterally, they just lose all vigor and die. But for the mango, you could manipulate the branches pretty well, and it would just continue growing. Sometimes I had to bring down the branch to the wire, and sometimes I had to bring up the branch to the wire. But these are just all things you come across. And this one would be an example of the keep mango, right? They don't like to flush off of the side, the whirl of shoots as much. And sometimes they'll flush 4 times, 5 times without any kind of branching off. And in the end, if you don't correct it in the beginning, what you can find is that it's only going to be flowering off of this end. But the truth is, you don't really need this much flowering wood in order to have good production. You don't even need this much. If you just had one shoot here and one spur here, that would be plenty of production per wire. So getting 2, 4, 6 on one wire should produce plenty enough flowers for to get good production. When you find yourself in this case, if you let it get this far, which I had let a bunch of trees get this far, in order to correct it, you got to go all the way back to that first shoot and reduce it and cut it off there and let the new growth reestablish the lateral leader and go from there. So again, staying on top of the pruning and not letting things get too far out of hand before you getting back and correcting it is essential to this efficiency. So that's the go 2-dimensional flat canopy. Again, the first year is just like time is flying. So the first year, there's very little to do. You're gonna tie down 1 or 2 branches. It's gonna take it does take a little bit longer because now you're using the vinyl tape and the trellis clips. And this little gem of a tool right here is the tape inner. If you are doing trellis work, you need the tape inner. The tape inner took pruning from maybe 2 minutes per tree in the first year, 2 minutes per tree to 15 seconds per tree, because that's how much faster it was using the tape inner than trying to tie knots with your hand. But like I said, so the first year, pretty simple. At the end of the first year, you had maybe you had some growth on the bottom wire and just starting to get trees onto the second wire, and maybe it's clipped, the central leader is clipped onto the third wire, right? So it's still pretty small. Here's another picture. This is the Namdak Mai. The Namdak Mai was having the different varieties on the trellis was really beneficial to see that not all trees are really do well on the trellis, and different shapes and patterns for different trees are necessary. And the Namdak Mai is a slower growing, almost like a dwarf tree that has stubbier branches that just does not like to bend completely laterally. And I broke more Namdak Mai branches than any of the other varieties, twice as much as any of the other varieties. And they just didn't really like the central leader nearly as much as some of the other ones, some of the other styles. So what I found in training, the majority of the trees were planted, were trained with the central leader look that we have here, where this one branch was trained along each side of the wire and to create this espalier kind of look. But like I said, the Namdak Mai didn't like to bend nearly as much, and I found myself doing more of a fan shape for a lot of the Namdak Mai and it did really well with the fan shape. And then I stopped breaking branches once I stopped forcing them to go where they didn't want to go. So I had already formed a couple of branches, and in which case, instead of reducing it back down to a central leader, I just allowed the uh, more of a fan shape to develop with this one again. This one I'd done it with a 2 leader, a double leader style, which works pretty well. It works pretty well. The lateral branches end up being only like 2 feet long instead of the 4 feet long that you'd go with the central leader. And so it's just going with what I had in front of me, and not trying to force the plant to grow in a way that it didn't want to grow. And that's what I find uh to be important, is to just not to force the branches to grow where they don't want to grow, because they're not going to get good results in that case. So these are different styles that I used, but the majority of the trees using this central leader style for the mangoes. And at the second year, again, we had a lot of flowering on the second year, but at the end of the second year, what we had branches trained along the bottom 2 wires, and some training on the third wire, and the central leader was usually clipped was clipped onto the fourth wire, but no development on the fourth wire at all. But because we had pretty good development on the bottom 2 wires, which are right here, when they flowered, I just let them go. And for the trellises, it really didn't affect the growth of the tree as much as the second year flowering affected the ultra high density field. On the trellises, with the branches trained around the wire and the support from the wire, it held on to its fruit pretty good, and it just continued to grow up at the same time. So I don't feel it lost any time having it flower on its second year, and because it was being trained along the wires, it didn't damage the tree or change the shape of the tree very much. So in that case, it wasn't a lot of mangoes because you're only talking about the 2 bottom wires, but it was pretty good. It was pretty good amount of mango that came off of that 2 bottom wires at the second year. So it started production a little bit earlier than the ultra high density. And this was, like I said, this is about what the trees was looking like. They still had a lot of growth to do in this space here, but it was already filled in the bottom 2 wires, started to fill in the third wire, and was usually clipped onto the fourth wire. And so this is what I was seeing at the end of the second year. And then we're going into the third year. This is a top view picture. It's so hard to get pictures in the orchard to really show what you're seeing. This is the top one. This would be at the end of the year, right before I was doing the end of the year pruning. And so you can see that the trellises are completely filled in the empty space, right? So if we go back to this 2-dimension canopy, right? All of this is now filled in with branches. So in coming in pruning, the goal is to open this up, remove all the growth within this area right here, and get it back to that 2-dimensional canopy, which up until this point has not interfered with flowering at all. Like I just go in, and there's a lot of growth that comes in like this, and I just remove all of that, and the outsides flower just fine right after that. So that is what looking at this is. This is probably the end of the third year, where the trees are now at the top of the wire, but they're not really formed. There's still a lot of growth to be had. You can see here, by the majority of the trees were kind of looking like this, where they had fully grown off onto the bottom 3 wires, and the fourth wire, it had started to be trained on, and it was already clipped to the 5th wire, which is the top of the trellis, and still, even though it still had a lot of growth here, it was these trees are already big enough to hold anywhere from 50 to 150 mangoes, depends on the variety. And you can see here, that's kind of what it looks like when it's flowering. And here's some examples of the production that I was getting on. This is the white piri. I always have to work a little harder to get the white piris to produce good mangoes. The keeps were really good, really productive. I had a lot of trees. I only have 2 rows on the trellises that are keep mangoes, and those 2 rows outproduce the remainder of the whole trellis just itself with poundage wise, because the keep mangoes are just so much more productive. And then, so coming back to how I established the trellises and if I would do anything different, you know, it's more compact. The length of the trellis doesn't really matter. You can go shorter or longer. If there's one thing I would change, I'd just open it up more just for more space, because, now that the trellises are in its 5th year and majority of the trees that fill in all of its spaces, I can see that there is shading going on. There is shading off on the lower parts of the tree. There's a lot less ground cover because of the shade that's being created. And so I think by opening it up more, I will get a little bit more light interception, and it'll help color up the fruit a little bit better, and it'll just be easier to work with. So again, it's just opening up more space. This makes everybody a little bit more happy. And then the wires, the one major change I would do about the trellises is with the wire orientation. So I started off with the bottom wire at 24 inches and each additional wire 18 inches, and with the top wire being at 8 feet tall. Now doing it again for mangoes, you can see right here, all of these mangoes right here are not going to be harvested because they're going to be on the ground, or they're at the chicken level where they'll peck every single one of those mangoes, even one peck, and then it's done, right? That mango is done even with one peck. So all of these mangoes, none of these will be harvested. And so in redoing the trellises, I would start with the bottom wire at 36 inches, which would be somewhere around here. The bottom wire would be 36 inches, and each additional wire would be at 15 inches. And that would still maintain the 5 wires on the trellises, with the top wire being at 8 feet, but it would give more space on the bottom for the mangoes to grow, because at this point, almost all my mangoes on the bottom wire, I just cannot get it through harvest because of the damage that they take being so low on the ground, and with the moor and all of that other things. So just getting the mangoes higher off the ground, that would be the one change I would really do with the trellises. So when I compare the two, the ultra high density versus the trellises, for the most part, I view these two systems as equals. And one major difference between the ultra high density plantation field and the open Tatura trellis, the one major difference is that the open Tatura trellis requires about $20,000 upfront costs in establishing that orchard for the materials of the trellis, and that is a pretty steep cost to have to eat without any production, right? And
Umi, did you find
the trellis? What was that?
Oh, I was gonna say,
Hello?
hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
One of the things they say the trellis is good for is protecting the trees in case of a storm or something. Did you find any?
Yeah.
Or were you going to talk about
that? Well, so when it comes to that aspect, in establishing, in adapting the open Tatura trellis to tropical fruits, and one of the motivations was to protect them from tropical cyclones. cyclones, which in North Queensland, where they developed this technique for tropical fruits, they would get hit by hurricanes all the time, right? And so in establishing this, it was with the understanding that the trellises would help to the trees to weather the storm. But man, I get a headache thinking about what if we had a hurricane and it broke the trellis, and we would have that all that high tensile wire and broken wood, and it would, I don't know if I would be able to replace that. And so the idea that these trellises break, it really causes me stress if they was to break. And I don't know how I would fix it. And so I'm not sure if I'm buying that it'll protect it from the big storms, and especially with mango, because mangoes are for the most part hurricane proof, right? They'll get hit hard, break all their branches, and they'll just come right back because they're pretty strong and vigorous trees, as opposed to say like avocados, which might just break all the trees in half and die in a hurricane. But I would think mangoes would survive, especially with the ultra high density. If I knew a hurricane was coming, and I would just go in and remove the canopy off of all the trees. I just cut off all the canopies, and then they would survive and grow back. In 2 years. It would be back in production, right? And so I don't really use the protection from storms as one of the incentives for using the trellises, because the idea of the trellis breaking, or like we had one uh farmer who had installed a trellis in the wet area of the island, and his trellis had failed within 18 months. The wood had just completely rotted out. I think it had got termites in the wood. Maybe it was like poorly treated wood, but it had completely rotted out and collapsed within 18 months. And so that does cause me stress, the idea of the trellis breaking, because I just don't know how we would repair it. So that with that, and with the whole upfront cost of the trellis, and being that it is about $20,000 in just material, right? And not even including the labor of installing these trellis, with just material is about $20,000 additional cost to the orchard. And I don't see the production being that much better. It might have been a little bit better on the trellises, but I don't think it was enough to make up for that added upfront cost that is required. And so in moving forward, I'm not really. I planted. I've done additional trellises, and I put different fruits on them, and that's still growing in a trial, and I haven't come to any determinations with that. But I have some avocados on trellises, and I have mountain apples on trellises, guavas, soursop, and yeah, that's what I have on trellises so far. And different fruits have different will benefit differently from the trellises, right? I feel that the guava will do really good on the trellis, and the frame of the trellis will allow me to come in and put a netting over the whole trellis to protect it from birds and fruit flies, which will definitely take up all of your guavas, right? You lose 80% of your guavas to birds and fruit flies. So being able to cover the whole trellis and protect the fruit, I think, might make it worthwhile to do the guavas on trellises. Yeah, so there's different benefits that might benefit other fruits, but I think mango, being as hardy and vigorous as it is, that it just simply doesn't need the trellis to be more productive. But it looks good. And if you have farm tours and people would come to your farm and see a row of trellises with mangoes all over it, fall in love with it. It looks good, it's productive, but I don't know if it's necessary for commercial production. And again, this is commercial production. So if you're talking about one row of trellises, then you're not dealing with the problems of having multiple rows of trellises, right? Or if you just have one section that you'd like to streamline and just put in a ton of mango trees on one trellis, it would work and it would be productive. And so up until this point, 2022 was my best mango year. this year was pretty much wasted because of all the rain we got, and the production was really low. And so what I got out of my fields in 2022 is I got about 6,000 pounds of mangoes out of my high density, the ultra high density field, and pretty much half of the trellises. The trellises didn't really produce that good. The keep mangoes produced really well. So out of that 6,000 pounds, maybe about 4,000 pounds was keeps. 1,000 pounds in the ultra high density field was Raposa and Manzanillo, and then I had about 1,000 pounds of white peri and Namdakmai in the trellises. But majority of the production was with the keep mango, and so not too bad, being that it was probably just a little over a half acre of production as far as the amount of trees that were produced in that year, to pull off 6,000 pounds. So, you know, uh, I 1 year, I had one good year from it. And so I look forward to this next year, where now I have about 3 acres of high density mangoes that'll be in production this year, with that half acre of the trellis mangoes. So this next upcoming year, I'm hoping to have a way better year than in the previous good year. But then, so in the beginning, it was all about improving Hawaii's mango industry. And my idea was that it's going to improve by introducing a well-organized, highly efficient orchard management system. But the more I get into it, the more I realize that it cannot just be about producing a higher quality mango if we're getting all of these losses in the post-harvest because we don't have the ability to store the mango or pack the mango correctly, or it's selling, out of the farmers market where there's just no chilling whatsoever, right? And so the second part of the grant had a small focus on post-harvest management of the orchard, because it's not good enough to just produce better quality mango if you cannot handle it properly, right? And so we're getting all these losses in pre-harvest. We're getting losses because we're not planting the right varieties, or we just getting too much pests. We're not managing pests enough, or it doesn't have water or fertilizer programs that is efficient, right? Or with the conventional orchards and the tall trees, you're getting so much loss coming from picking and scratching the fruit, and fruits rubbing up against each other, and just generally poor handling. Are we picking in the mornings before it gets too hot? Are we getting it washed and stored in cool storage quick enough to reduce the deterioration of the fruit, which happens immediately from picking, right? And then post-harvest, are we able to do cold storage or packing material? Is it going into the right types of boxes, right? All of these things are causing losses, which is contributing to the overall low production of our mango. And so the second part and then processing, right? And then with processing is just the outlet. Do we have outlets that we can get rid of our B mangoes, right? Or mangoes that need to be processed? If the more outlets we have for that, the more we can get rid of the mango, and it just doesn't get lost because it's not suitable for fresh mango sales, right? And so the second part of the grant had a little bit of focus on post-harvest, and for that and this didn't pan out as well as I'd wanted it as far as the grant goes, because it was right in the middle of COVID and everything got stopped and hard to move forward. And so I did what I can. But so the two other focuses, one was on preventing sap burn on the mangoes to improve the quality, right? And this would be done at harvest and post-harvest, is to prevent the sap burn. And what I find is that in Hawaii, for the most part, we pick mangoes in the ripe stage, where color break. Color break is pretty much where we pick mangoes at. If you pick mangoes at color break, you only really have like 4 days to fully ripe for your mango. So in that case, we don't get affected by sap burn because we pick in the mangoes when they're fully ripe, and the fully ripe mangoes, they don't sap out nearly as much as the green mature mangoes. And we have to really sell them or consume the mangoes within 4 days. So we don't even really see sap burn. But if we're gonna grow our mango industry, if we're gonna increase our production into commercial production of mangoes in Hawaii, then we're gonna have to at some point reduce the damage caused by sap burn. And so here's just a couple examples of the effects of sap burn. This is a long-term effect of sap burn on the mangoes. And this right here, you can see this picture picked up the sap burn really good. If you was looking at the mango in hand, this was like a dark green color, but it wasn't brown like that until the picture came out. So it really shows the effects of the sap on the skin and how it discolors the mango, right? And so a way to prevent some of the sapping is to pick the mango with the stem on, and then removing the stem later when you're in the packing house where you can wash the mango, or if you let the mango sit for a few hours, then it won't sap out once you break that stem down. The Australians have been the leaders in educating about the effects of sap burn, and they have a number of different products that you can use called mango wash. That is basically like lye and salt and detergents that that um, that inoculates or that that it breaks down the caustic compounds of the mango sap and prevents this mango burning. So these are things that we're gonna eventually have to incorporate into our production to reduce the damage on the fruits. If we're doing all of these things and we're reducing damage by 1% here and 2% there and 5% there, it all adds up to more better production in the end, right? And so reducing sap burn, I think, is going to be important in the future as we develop and as we grow our mango industry in Hawaii. And the second part is cold storage. And so for this part of the grant, I was gonna build a cold storage using a shipping container. But right when I got this grant and the whole COVID, the shipping containers just like doubled in prices and everything kind of got out of hand. And so what we have with the CoolBot is the ability to build your own cold storage unit at a pretty affordable price and to be able to extend the shelf life of your fruits, right? And so for mangoes, if you can store the mango at 55 degrees, you can extend your shelf life up to 14 days. I use 14 days because in my opinion, after 14 days of cold storage, the mango would just would deteriorate in quality at that point. It'll lose its sourness. It'll create a bland flavor, and the reality is that the majority of mangoes that at least go to the United States, that unless they come from Mexico, any other mango that is coming from farther away is taking longer than 14 days to the market. And the reality is it takes more like 20 days to get to the market. And that is the number one hindering factor with mango sales in the United States, is just the fact that they cannot get the mango from the orchard to the consumer in a fast enough period of time before the deterioration starts. Because the reality is, if you're getting a mango from Ecuador, or if you're getting a mango from Brazil in the United States, it's going to take close to 30 days in order to do that. And if you storing mangoes at 55 degrees will extend your shelf life. However, if you go colder than 55 degrees, then you can start to see cold damage, which if any of you had ever picked up a grocery store mango and cut it open and it's completely gray inside, and that is usually the result of cold damage, because when you're in Brazil and it's going to take you 30 days to get your fruit to the market, if you leave it at 55 degrees, the mango is still going to ripen and soften in that time, and then the whole container is going to get rejected. So to try to prevent the container from getting rejected, they're going to crank down the temperature to about 40 degrees, and all the damage is going to be internal, and you're not going to be able to see it, but everybody gonna be happy because they sell the mango, except for the consumer who gets home, cuts it open, and finds just a gray mess, right? But so the Coolbot is a external thermostat that you can attach to a window AC unit, and they can convert that window AC uh, into a refrigerator, because the only difference basically between an AC and a refrigerator is the thermostat that allows it to go colder, right? So if you attach a Coolbot to a window AC, you can bring down the temperature as much as 31 degrees, right? And so all of a sudden, it makes it affordable for small farmers or rural farmers to be able to build their own cold storage unit. Because this is a cold storage unit right here that is about the size of the one that I ended up building, which is 8 by 12 feet, and 15,000 cost $15,000, right? So the majority of small farmers are not going to be able to afford a cold storage unit that is bought manufactured. But so I couldn't get the container to build the Coolbot storage. So, but well, I did have a storage room that was available. So I built, me and my father-in-law, we built in 3 days, built this 10 by 12 foot storage unit. We insulated everything as much as we could, and we got it going. So for about $3,500, right? So we got this whole cold storage unit for about $3,500, as opposed to $15,000 for a manufactured unit. And I think in the end, this is gonna pay for itself by just extending my shelf life, right? Because the previous year, without the storage unit, when I was harvesting, I could have used it. I could have used that an extra maybe 10 days to be able to sell my mangoes, and I lost a lot of mangoes to just over ripeness, because I had just no way to slow down the ripening. So, just things that we're gonna have to do in order to grow our mango industry in Hawaii. And uh, the more efficient, the more organized, the more, let's see, go back to this, the more we can reduce the losses in each area, the better off, the more we're going to be able to increase our production, right? And that's just the things that I've been going through over the last few years. And that's about what I have for you guys. Is there any questions out there? No. So if not, well, thank you guys for tuning in. It was an hour and a half, and it takes a lot of time out of your day. So I appreciate you guys coming in and participating in my project. And
Umi, I had a question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure.
Peter again. You noted the drip irrigation with it sounded like one emitter at 2 gallons per minute, or two gallons an hour. Where do you recommend positioning the emitter, considering in relation to the center of the tree?
Yeah. So you get best growth if you put that emitter right on the tree, right on the trunk. Not putting water under the trunk, but the closer you are to the root ball, the better growth you're going to get from the tree. But the challenge that I have is that the drip emitters cover such a small space, and it and it's good for deep irrigation. But what I really could use is more of a spread out irrigation that could cover, more area that is from the 0 to 15 inches deep in the soil, where the feeder roots are located. And so I just use drip irrigations, but lately I've been going in and replacing them with the adjustable emitters that put out a uh, little fan up, and maybe goes out about 18 inches at most, and that way I can cover a little bit more ground than just the deep watering drip emitters. And it really is a challenge having the trees really close together and finding the right emitters, right? Because conventional orchard, they'll just use those sprinklers, and the sprinklers usually have about 15 feet diameter coverage, and I cannot use any of those because it's just too much. It just goes too much, too far. And then and the smaller emitters, the micro emitters with sprayers, because of the high pressure that I have, it just puts out like a mist, right? And so it does get a little tricky finding the right emitters. But when you're establishing the trees, I find that having that emitter right on the root wall is gonna be the best place for it. But after a couple of years, then it could use to have it spaced out, or at least a spray emitters included.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Hey, Umi, I noticed a question in chat, and I had the same question as you were presenting. So it's from is it Huey Lamb? He says, "Where did you get your trees to get started, and how old or big were they before you planted them?"
Yeah, right. So, I grafted all of my own trees because that's just the only economical way that you can do it in Hawaii, because there's no commercial orchards in Hawaii where each the best deal you can probably get is $35 per tree, and that just adds too much cost to the establishment. So I grafted my own trees. I expect that most people would have to graft their own trees in Hawaii, or even the United States, Florida, where they have like 2-year backlog on ordered trees. We don't have the government support that I wish we had. In Dominican Republic, when they established their mango industry, the government provided the trees for them, and then at affordable rates, like $4 a tree, $8 a tree, right? Something that you can afford to do. So yeah, that is a limiting factor, and that is one of the limiting factors of the ultra high density, or any high density orchard management system, is the sheer amount of trees. That was also a motivating factor for me to want to open up the space too, from 450 trees per acre to 250 trees, because that's just that much less trees that I need to graft. But not only that, but like my nursery gets expensive too, because if you got 1,000 trees in your nursery that you have to manage, it just all of a sudden you need a full-time worker just to manage your nursery. So on that end too, I've now started just planting seedlings into the ground and going back and top working the trees in the field, in order to eliminate the need to have all these trees in my nursery.
Great answer. Yeah.
Umi, real quick about the irrigation. Did you ever try the kind of like pigtail type, using the drip tubing, make a little spiral around the tree?
Well, because my trees is, I guess that would be, I guess that would, it just seems like so much work to do. Like 300 trees, I have to pigtail 300 trees. It just gets so daunting. As opposed to the conventional orchards where you only have like 50 or 70 trees per acre, maybe pigtailing all of those trees is not as much of work. So I guess the amount of labor that goes into it is what stops me from doing that, because because I've had a design made up for me that included pigtails around the tree, but I just never got around to doing it.
That makes sense with the labor
Yeah.
constraint.
Mm,
Yumi,
yeah.
quick question.
So,
Do you ever have to ship any of your mangoes? And if so, what do you find is easiest to ship?
well, I haven't been shipping mangoes at the moment. The plan is to end up having to get to Oahu, because Oahu is where everybody is, and in which case, you really got to perfect the picking of your mango in the green mature stage, because you're not going to be able to ship ripe mangoes at all. Ripe mangoes do not ship well, and so they have to be green and hard, but in this green mature stage, right? So that's going to be a necessity of shipping mangoes. Yeah. So if there's no more questions, again, thank you guys for coming. I'm usually pretty receptive to email, or if you can track me down on YouTube or anything, like on Facebook or anything like that. I'm always happy to answer questions and to continue the dialogue. But other than that, this would be the end of the webinar. So thanks
so
again.
much, Jimmy. That was great.
Awesome, Umi. There was one more question about where you sell your mangoes on Kauai.
I sell out of my store in Waimea. I have Umi store across the Waimea Theater, and then I have a person that I sell my mangoes to. She does all of the markets, so won't know it's my mango, but it'll be at the farmers markets.
Will you have a recording of this this webinar, Yumi?
I believe there will be some of it was caught on the recording, and I'll have it up on my YouTube page.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, sorry, I think we just missed maybe the first 5 or 10 minutes or so. But I can send you the
thanks for
recording.
catching that. Yeah,
No
I appreciate
problem.
it. Yeah, I noticed when he went on, and I was like, oh.
Yumi, do you plan to have any more like presentations like that, or is that the only one?
I mean, I usually have some presentations that go on, and then I'm also a part of the Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers, and we have our annual conference, and I usually do some kind of presentation at our annual conference. Yeah,
Okay.
and I tend to have workshops on the island all the time.
Yeah, because this was excellent.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks again, Umi. If there aren't any more questions, I might go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again, Emily.